Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take these huge foundational questions of, well, what it means to be human, and we really dig into your source material, the articles, the research, all of it, to pull out what you can actually use.
And today, we are tackling a colossal subject. I mean, it's really the concept that sits right at the center of every thought you have, every choice you make, every single memory. We're talking about the nature of the self.
Who is that I? The one that remembers things, that wants things, and maybe most importantly for our listener, the one that changes.
That's the key word, isn't it? Change.
It is. Our listener, who goes by the learner, has given us this incredible stack of sources, all focused on what they're calling the fluid architecture of the self. So the mission for this deep dive is really clear.
Go.
We need to untangle this I, figure out if it has, a fixed address.
And then analyze that very tricky balance between how stable it feels and how much it can actually transform.
The sources throw this paradox at us right from the very beginning. We go through life feeling like one continuous person. The me from childhood is the same me sitting here now.
Right, there's this powerful sense of continuity.
But at the same time, we're so confident when we say things like, oh, I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago.
We all say that.
We all say it. So we feel constant, but we know we're fluid. It's a fundamental contradiction.
It is.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got everything from ancient Buddhist philosophy to modern cognitive psych. We have arguments for fixed souls. We have these challenging ideas of constant flow, narrative construction.
Talking some classic thought experiments.
Exactly. So the goal here is to give you, the listener, a really complete, informed view of your own internal structure. But before we can even get into the debate about how stable or fluid the self is, we have to agree on what we're actually talking about.
Precisely. That's the first hurdle. The word self is a bit of a linguistic chameleon. If we don't pull it apart into, let's say, manageable pieces, we just end up talking past each other. Which is why the sources spend so much time on this. They lay out 4 distinct facets that we usually just jumble together when we say I.
And the first one, facet 1, feels like the most elemental, the most immediate part of just being alive.
It is. It's the subjective experience, or, just the awareness. This is the simple fact of being aware. It's the observing consciousness.
The raw presence.
The raw, non-judgmental presence that is seeing, hearing, thinking, and feeling. It's that center point, the I, that exists kind of behind the stream of all your mental stuff.
So if I'm just sitting quietly and thoughts about what I need to do later, or a memory, or the feeling of the chair, all that stuff is flowing through my mind. Facet 1 is the part of me that's just watching it all go by.
The witness.
The witness, exactly. Even if the thoughts are complete chaos, the presence of that witness, that feels constant.
Perfectly put. It's that purely phenomenal aspect of just being present. It's what a lot of meditative practices try to isolate. Now, facet 2 immediately starts layering content onto that awareness.
Okay.
This is personality and character, the traits. This is all about your relatively consistent behavioral and emotional patterns.
So these are the qualities that feel more intrinsic. Like, are you predictably introverted or extroverted? Are you usually kind or, quick to anger? The tendencies that sort of shape how you walk into a new situation.
And these are often seen as endogenous. They come more from within, maybe rooted in your biology or your early development. They define the habitual way you tend to act, even when your surroundings change.
But then we pivot pretty hard with facet 3, which feels much more external.
Right. Facet 3 is identity, the definition. This is how you categorize yourself, mostly through your external roles, social groups, and your values.
So your job title, your role as a parent or a student.
A spouse, your nationality, your culture, the things you stand for. I care about justice, for example.
So this facet is fundamentally exogenous. It's contextual. It's the answer to the question, what role am I playing in the world right now? At work, I'm a manager. At home, I'm a father. And these roles, even though I internalize them, they're defined by the society around me.
A great way to separate facet 2 from facet 3 is that character, facet 2, is how you play the role. Identity, facet 3, is what role you're playing.
Oh, that's a great distinction.
So an inherently shy person, that's facet 2, can still take on the identity of a teacher, facet 3, but they're probably going to play that role in a quieter, more introverted way.
Got it. And that brings us to the last one, facet 4, which seems to pull it all together. The great synthesizer.
That's the narrative self, the story. And this is maybe the most dynamic, most psychological facet of all. It's the continuous, cohesive story you build about your entire life.
So you're weaving everything together. Your awareness, your traits, your roles.
Exactly. You're linking past events to your present situation and what you want for the future. It's that internal monologue that gives it all meaning. I grew up with this challenge, which is why I value this today, and therefore I'm pursuing this goal now.
That's the connector. So when we argue about the self, we're usually mixing up all four of these things. The awareness, the stable traits, the changing roles, and the story that ties it all up.
And the real work of this deep dive is to figure out which of those are fixed and which are totally fluid.
All right, let's start where I think most people intuitively land, this idea of stability. It's a comforting thought, right? And it's definitely baked into a lot of traditions, this belief that there's a fixed me underneath all the changes.
This is the deep core view. In philosophy, it's often called essentialism. The core concept is just that. There's an inner foundational essence that stays you, no matter what happens to your appearance, your job, your opinions.
And you mentioned the analogy of clothing. That feels like the most accessible way to think about it. Changes in behavior or beliefs. They're just like changing your clothes. The self, the real I, is the one who's wearing them, and that part doesn't change.
It's identity permanence, exactly.
Yeah.
And this view, it's often tied to religious ideas like an immortal soul, or more secular ideas like a fixed temperament or a true self that you have to go out and discover.
So what are the arguments for it? The sources lay out three major ones.
They do. The first is the continuity of experience. You touched on this earlier.
Yeah.
Despite all the radical shifts in your life, that subjective feeling is always there. The someone who was 5 and scraped their knee, the someone who is stressed about exams, and someone listening right now. They all feel like the same fundamental subject. That powerful intuitive feeling of being continuous is really, really hard to just dismiss.
I find that one incredibly compelling. I mean, without that continuity, you'd wake up every morning feeling like a brand new person. And that's just not how we experience life, not even after a major crisis.
The sources would say that subjective feeling is a necessary condition for identity, even if it's not the whole story. But the second argument, it moves beyond just a feeling and into, well, necessity, moral responsibility. This is arguably the most practical argument for an enduring self. It's the bedrock of our entire legal and ethical systems.
I can see why. Yeah. If the self was just a new flow of experience every single day, how could you hold anyone accountable for anything?
You couldn't. We praise people, we punish them, we make them pay for damages based on the assumption that the person who did the act 10 years ago, or even 10 minutes ago, is the same self who has to answer for it today.
Right.
If identity was purely fluid, legal systems would they'd collapse. Imagine trying to tell a judge, oh, that was the me from 2015. That self is gone now, so I'm not responsible for their crime.
So stability is a kind of social contract as much as it is a metaphysical reality. We have to enforce the permanence of the self, because without it, accountability just vanishes.
That's the practical takeaway, for sure. And the third argument, it focuses less on metaphysics and more on observable psychology, on temperament. It's the idea of a deep temperament.
So our sources are pointing to longitudinal studies here, things that follow people over long periods of time.
Exactly. They show this profound consistency in our baseline emotional patterns. Research by people like Thomas and Chess on temperament, or, the later work on the Big Five personality traits. It all suggests that certain core dispositions are established very early and are incredibly resistant to change.
What kind of dispositions are we talking about?
Things like how reactive you are to new things, your baseline energy level, your natural tendency toward being introverted or extroverted. This baseline feels like, this is just how I'm wired. And while you can change your behavior with a lot of effort, that fundamental sensitivity often remains.
So if we use this landscape analogy I've seen in the notes, even if I learn to meditate and I become less reactive in my outward behavior, the inner mountain of my innate sensitivity is still there. I still have to work harder to stay calm than someone who was just born with a low reactivity temperament.
That's it, exactly. The deep core doesn't dictate all your behavior.
Yeah.
But it sort of sets the gravitational pull of your existence. It establishes the starting point for all your future growth and how much energy you'll have to spend to make certain changes. It suggests that while your roles, facet 3, and your story, facet 4, change all the time,
Right.
the foundational personality structure, facet 2, that might be largely fixed, or at least it only shifts very, very slowly.
That was a really powerful case for stability. But for this to be a true deep dive, we have to pivot right away to the view that just blows that whole premise up, the ultimate counter-argument.
The idea that there's no fixed core at all.
None.
This is the radical position. It's often called the bundle theory in Western philosophy. David Hume was a big champion of this, and it gets its most profound treatment in the no-self, or anatta doctrine in Buddhist philosophy. It directly challenges that assumption that there has to be an enduring wearer of the clothes.
It just asks the simple question, where is it? If everything that makes me up is changing, how can I be permanent?
That's the question. The core concept here is that the self isn't some fixed, separate substance that exists underneath experience. Instead, the self is just a composite, a bundle, or a stream of constantly changing events.
So thoughts, sensations, memories.
Emotions, roles, they're all temporary phenomena. They arise, and then they pass away.
And the big mistake, according to this view, is that our minds tend to bundle all these temporary things together and then mistakenly invent this solid, continuous I that supposedly owns all those experiences.
Hume said it perfectly. He said when he looked inward, he only ever found some particular perception or other of heat or cold, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. He could never catch the self itself, separate from all those perceptions.
So when you look for the self, all you find are the contents of your mind. And they're always moving. You find the wave, but you can't find some permanent island underneath it.
In the Buddhist tradition, they detail this bundle using what they call the 5 aggregates, or skandhas. That's form, feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness. These 5 things are what make up a person.
And the key point is?
The key point is that every single one of them is impermanent. Therefore, the combination of these 5 is also impermanent. They would say that clinging to the idea of a fixed self is what creates suffering because you're fighting against the reality of constant change.
And that leads us straight to that crucial analogy from the sources, the river analogy.
Yes, this is the one to remember. A river, let's say the Mississippi, it has a name, it has a legal identity, a history, but it's not a fixed thing.
Right.
The water flowing past you today will be somewhere else tomorrow. It's a continuous, always changing flow of water molecules and sediment and everything else. The self is defined in the same way. It is a process, a continuous flow of psychological and physical events. It's not a solid, static object that stays the same.
But I have to stop you there, because I can hear the skeptical listener pushing back. If the self is just a fluid stream, how do we explain that powerful feeling of continuity of experience we just talked about? Doesn't this view make life feel incoherent?
That is the big philosophical hurdle, and the Sources has a pretty sophisticated answer. They say the continuity is in the flow, not in the object. Imagine lighting one candle from another.
Okay.
The second flame is causally dependent on the first one, but it is not the same flame. It's a new flame. Similarly, the person you are today is causally dependent on the person you were yesterday. We have this relational continuity, this causal link that connects the moments together without needing some fixed soul to do it.
Okay. So persistence isn't about an identity substance surviving. It's about an identity relationship surviving from moment to moment.
Exactly. And the most challenging part of this view goes back to that introspection argument we mentioned. When you really truly look inward, the moment you try to name a self, you're only naming a perception that just happened. You find the continuous process of thinking and feeling, but you never find a separate solid thing called self standing apart from it all.
So the self is a useful fiction, necessary for society, but not a metaphysical reality.
That's the view.
So, if the deep core view gives us the stability we need for moral accountability, this no-self view gives us the insight we need for profound psychological freedom, the realization that nothing about your present state is permanently fixed.
That's the therapeutic and spiritual implication, absolutely. Realizing you're a process, not a statue, is what opens the door to real transformation.
Okay, so now we can transition from that sort of pure metaphysical debate, is the self fixed or is it fluid, to the more practical constructionist views, the ones that focus on how we actively build the self through memory and through our relationships.
And these perspectives, they offer really direct paths for how to change. We can start with the internal architect. The self as a story.
The idea here is that the self is, at its core, a story. One that's constantly being written, edited, revised. We're meaning-making creatures, right? And the only way to make sense of that chaotic stream of experiences from the bundle view is to weave it all together into a coherent plot.
The Sources really emphasize this mechanics of storytelling. Psychologists like Dan McAdams suggest that around late adolescence, we start to develop an integrative life story or a narrative identity. We select certain memories, key events, successes, failures.
The turning point.
The turning points, exactly. And we connect them and interpret them, weaving them into a narrative. This story is what answers that deep question. How did I become the person I am today?
And what's crucial here is that this story isn't just a passive reflection, it's an active construction. We often use templates that we get from our culture: the hero's journey, the victim's story, the redemption arc. Our narrative self, facet 4, is how we structure and make sense of our traits, facet 2, and our roles, facet 3.
And this narrative serves these massive functions. It gives us coherence, a sense of a life path instead of just random events. It helps us make sense of suffering. It rationalizes difficult choices. A period of poverty isn't just a bad time. It gets reframed as the thing that taught me resilience.
And it becomes a shared reality. We tell these stories constantly in therapy, on a first date, in a job interview, and sharing them reinforces the reality of the self we're presenting. It makes that internal story socially real.
And the real strength of this narrative view, especially for anyone interested in transformation, is how well it explains change. If the self is a story, then profound change is simply the act of rewriting the plot. Or, more subtly, just editing your interpretation of the events.
But I have to ask, for the skeptical listener, how is rewriting your story not just, well, lying to yourself or just wishful thinking?
That's a crucial challenge.
Mm.
The sources would respond that rewriting the story isn't about changing the facts, the events of the events. It's about changing the emotional and the explanatory weight that those events carry.
Okay.
Psychologically, this involves something called memory reconsolidation. When you retrieve an old, painful memory, your brain has this short window where it can associate new information with it before it stores it again. So a therapist might help you retrieve a memory of failure and then immediately help you reframe it. So you store it back not as proof I'm inadequate, but as valuable research or fuel for next time.
So the past is the past, but its meaning and how it shapes your future. That can shift dramatically. You're not just what happened to you, you're how you interpret and integrate what happened. And that allows for radical self-revision.
But we do have to talk about the limits. The narrative isn't pure fiction. You can't just write a story where you're 8 feet tall. And you can't just narrate your way out of certain genetic predispositions or, deep-seated trauma. The story has to rest on the bedrock of your bodily reality, actual events, and that deep temperament we talked about. The narrative is a powerful editor, but it needs real material to work with.
Okay, so from the internal architect to the external influences.
Exactly. The second constructionist view shifts our focus completely outward, the social self. This argues that the self is inherently co-created through our relationships and our society.
We're social products. The self isn't some private thing locked inside your skull. It's a relational phenomenon.
Absolutely. The philosopher George Herbert Mead talked about the I, the spontaneous, creative self, and the me, the self you see through the eyes of others. Our sources point out the critical role of early influence. From the moment you're born, your caregiver acts as a mirror.
This is the looking glass self idea.
That's it, from Charles Horton Cooley. We imagine how we appear to other people. We imagine their judgment of that appearance, and then we develop our feelings about ourselves, pride or shame, based on what we perceive that judgment to be.
So if a child is repeatedly told they're difficult or anxious, that external label starts to form the internal foundation of their identity, their facet 3, before they even have the words for it.
And as we grow, the environment provides the categories.
Yeah.
Cultural categories define our identity. Culture gives us these ready-made scripts and boxes, gender roles, what a professional acts like, religious identity, class. We define ourselves by the groups we belong to, or even the groups we actively resist.
That's a powerful mechanism. It explains why moving to a new country or, entering a totally new social world can cause a real identity crisis. The old social mirrors are gone, and the new ones aren't reflecting a familiar image yet.
And the result is the internalization of views. External expectations become internal commands. A parent tells a child, "You're an artist." And that can become a core truth that shapes a whole career path. Or, "You're not good at math," can become a self-limiting belief for life, regardless of actual talent.
And this is a critical point from the sources. We're not just passive puppets of all this.
No, absolutely not. We retain agency. We're shaped by the social world, but we have the capacity to resist, to question, and ultimately to reject the labels that are put on us. Some of the deepest moments of self-discovery happen when you consciously step outside of a prescribed social role and choose an identity for yourself.
So who you are is this constant dynamic dialogue between your internal story and all those external expectations.
It is, and that leads us to the thing that grounds both of those, the physical reality of being alive. We have to address the embodied self.
This really pushes back against that old Cartesian idea of the self being this ghost in the machine, a pure mind that's separate from the clumsy body it lives in.
It shatters that illusion. It challenges the idea of having a body and argues instead that the self is a body-mind unity. The self is sensory, it's emotional, it's physical, it's not just thoughts in a head. When you make a big decision, it's not just a cognitive process. There's often a physical gut feeling involved.
Hmm.
Your physiology is constantly informing your psychology.
So the body is way more than just a vehicle for the brain. It's the source of our fundamental perception of the world.
And it acts as a literal memory keeper. It carries habits, emotional history, things that are woven right into our physical structure. Think about muscle memory for an athlete, or on a darker note, the posture and automatic physical reactions, the tension in your shoulders or shallow breathing that develops from chronic stress.
So if I struggle with chronic anxiety, that anxiety isn't just a mental pattern. It's an entrenched physiological state. It's a fight or flight response that's been stored in my nervous system.
Precisely. The sources are implicitly referencing ideas like polyvagal theory, which suggests our deepest sense of safety or threat is rooted in the physical state of our nervous system. Your posture, the way you walk, the tension in your jaw, these are all subconscious expressions of your narrative self and your character traits.
And on a bigger scale, the body is shaping our entire experience. Our physical reality dictates how we interact with the world. How you feel walking through a crowd, whether you feel big or small, strong or vulnerable, healthy or sick, that defines a core part of your self-perception.
A major shift in your physical health or ability can instantly and dramatically rewrite your narrative self because the body has just changed the raw material that the story has to work with.
This sounds absolutely critical for anyone interested in real transformation. Why is this so important for change?
Because it has huge implications for change. If the self is an embodied unit, then changing the self has to involve changing physical practices, your posture, your habits, your environment. You can't just think your way into being brave if your body is still carrying the physical tension and hormonal signatures of chronic fear.
So you can read a news story about being resilient, but if you don't incorporate physical practices like exercise or breath work or somatic therapy, that news story is going to feel fake because your body is still expressing the old fearful self.
You have to move the body to move the self. The physical habits are like the operating system. If you want to install a new program, like a new character trait, you have to update the hardware. That's the grounded, practical necessity of the embodied view.
Okay, so this brings us right back to the central question. But now we're armed with all this complexity. The four facets, the fixed core versus fluid flow, the constructed narratives. Can the self actually change?
And the final, qualified answer from our sources is still yes. Change is possible. But we need to understand where and how that plasticity exists. It's not instant, it's not universal, and it's definitely not limitless. So we need to break the self down into three distinct layers of, let's call it volatility.
Okay, let's start with layer one.
Layer one, things that change easily. This covers the more superficial aspects of your identity, facet 3, and the content of your awareness, facet 1. These are the things that can shift really rapidly with new information or new life stages.
The obvious examples are external roles. They change all the time. You go from student to employee, single to married, manager to leader. These require a quick retooling of your behavior, but the core person underneath feels pretty much intact.
And of course, preferences change easily. Your taste in music, fashion, hobbies. More significantly, your beliefs and opinions, political, religious, can be totally altered by a compelling argument or a crisis that just shatters your worldview. These are the surface layers. They're highly responsive to what's happening outside of you.
It's like redecorating the house. It matters a lot for your daily life, but you're not moving the foundational load-bearing walls.
Exactly, which brings us to layer 2.
Layer two, things that change slowly, but can shift.
This is the layer that really holds the key to personal transformation, because these are the elements that feel fixed but are fundamentally plastic. This is where the real work happens, requiring time and sustained effort.
And this layer includes the deeper parts of our personality, facet 2, and our emotional patterns.
That's right. It includes your core character traits, patience, generosity, honesty. These are habits of being that you've built up over decades. It also includes your entrenched emotional patterns like chronic anxiety, how you handle conflict, and your deep-seated attachment style that dictates how you connect with people.
And the internal monologue, the self-image, lives here too, that deep story about your own worth and capability. These are the narratives that determine whether you go for an opportunity or you shrink back in fear.
And the really optimistic news, which comes from neuroscience and modern psychology, is that the brain and personality are highly plastic. They can adapt and rewire. The mechanics of change at this level really rely on Hebbian theory. Neurons that fire together wire together.
So if you continuously practice a new behavior like, say, responding to stress with a deep breath instead of snapping at someone, you are literally building new, stronger neural pathways in your brain.
You are.
So if I start practicing generosity every single day, I'm not just performing generosity, I'm literally changing my character, facet two, by creating these new neural highways that make being generous the default, easy path. And that's why it's so slow. It requires the physical restructuring of the brain.
It takes months or years of consistent effort to move these patterns from being consciously difficult to subconsciously automatic.
Yeah.
But the self is not genetically doomed to the patterns from childhood. This layer represents freedom through persistent work.
And finally, we hit the deepest layer, the load-bearing walls. The things that, maybe you can manage them or channel them, but you can rarely, if ever, just erase them.
This is layer 3, things that might be more stable. And here we circle right back to temperament. That baseline sensitivity, your raw energy level, your natural pull toward introversion or extroversion. These are often seen as biologically rooted and very resistant to major shifts.
Let me challenge that for a second. If layer 2 is so plastic, why is layer 3 so stable? Isn't temperament just a really, really old habit?
That's a fair challenge. The sources would suggest the difference is how close it is to your biological core. While someone with a high reactivity temperament can learn emotional management, that's a layer 2 change, they will probably always experience a stronger initial physiological jolt from a stimulus than a low reactivity person.
So the amplitude of the internal feeling is stable, but the response to that feeling is fluid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This also includes certain core vulnerabilities and strengths. If you have a natural talent for spotting patterns, that's a strength. But you might also have a vulnerability to overanalysis or anxiety, which is sort of the other side of that same coin. You can learn to manage the anxiety, but that underlying tendency for intense pattern recognition often stays.
Which brings us back to that landscape analogy, which really ties it all together beautifully. The self is like a territory. The mountains of temperament, layer 3, they're stable. They define the geography. The character traits and emotional patterns, layer 2, they're like the main roads. They were slowly built. They're hard to reroute, but it's possible.
And the roles and preferences, layer 1, are like the weather and the clothes people are wearing, changing constantly.
Okay, to make this whole idea of radical change versus continuity really concrete and memorable, we have to bring in that classic philosophical puzzle, the ship of Theseus.
It's the perfect metaphor for the self because it forces you to confront the core question: what holds identity together when all the parts change? So, the puzzle is this. Imagine the legendary ship of the hero Theseus, and it's preserved in a harbor. Over decades, every single plank, every mast, every rope rots and is replaced one by one until none of the original materials are left.
The question is it still the same ship?
Is it still the ship of Theseus?
Logically, based on what it's made of, the answer has to be no. It's 0% original matter. But, conceptually, legally, we keep the name, we treat it as the same historical artifact.
Now let's apply that puzzle to the self. Every cell in your body, with few exceptions, have been replaced. Your neural connections have been rewired. Your core beliefs might be completely different at age 55 than they were at 5. You are physically and psychologically a totally different bundle of material and experience.
Yet we keep the same name. We're treated as the same person legally and socially.
So if the ship's planks are replaced and our cells and beliefs are replaced, what is that crucial overlap that maintains the continuity of identity?
And to really dig into this, we have to use that extension of the puzzle from the sources, the reconstituted ship problem.
Yes. So imagine a collector gathers up all the old rotting planks that were replaced and meticulously reconstructs the original ship. It's now floating right next to the new ship. Now, which one is the ship of Theseus?
Oh, that is a brutal question for the self. If I successfully overcome an addiction and I reform my character, that's replacing the planks.
Yeah.
And then a new person emerges who has my exact same old habits, the reconstituted ship, who owns my original identity.
Exactly. It forces us to define what maintains identity. And it's not a fixed substance. It's a composite of functional overlaps. The continuity is held together by 3 key things. First, the continuity of the body and brain. Even as the cells change, the overall structure, the pattern, the functional organization of your physical being is maintained. Second, you have overlapping memories and relationships. You still have some memories from your childhood, and crucially, your long-term relationships, your facet 3, they anchor you to that past identity. Your parents or your partner, they remember the 20-year-old you, connecting the self across time through that shared experience.
And third, the continuity of the life story, the narrative self, facet 4. The story we keep telling ourselves even when we revise it is what links the 5-year-old to the 55-year-old. It's the thread we all agree on.
And that overlap is usually enough to sustain identity. We agree to keep calling that continuous flowing process you. This means the self can change radically, but enough overlap remains in the story, in the relationships, in the brain's pattern, to ensure we have accountability and familiarity.
But the sources do remind us that this has limits. In cases of extreme change, like a severe brain injury or dementia where the memories vanish, or a really profound fracturing trauma, that overlap can become so thin that the whole question of identity becomes genuinely painful.
When the narrative is lost, or the core pattern of the brain is fundamentally altered, the claim to be the same self is severely challenged. And that causes deep distress for the person and for the loved ones who anchor their identity.
This is where we bring all of this, all the philosophy and psychology, back to your practical life, listener. Because understanding this architecture of the self isn't just an academic game. It directly informs how you approach growth, responsibility, and compassion every single day.
We're shifting from the what is it to the so what. What are the practical implications of all this?
Right. Let's start with responsibility and growth.
Our deep dive into fixed cores versus fluid processes, it directly impacts how we approach personal development. And we see two dangerous extremes that can really get in the way of growth.
The first danger is the fixed mindset. This comes from an extreme deep core view. This is just who I am, I can't change it. It's treating everything like a layer 3 problem. If you see yourself as totally fixed, you abandon growth way too easily.
For instance, using a natural tendency toward introversion as an excuse to avoid all necessary social events, instead of learning how to manage that energy through practice, which is layer 2 work.
And the second danger comes from the other extreme, an overly flexible no-self view. It's the idea that the self is infinitely malleable.
This can cause you to underestimate your real constraints, like your temperament or your embodied history. And that leads to frustration and burnout when you don't see instant transformation. You can't just rewrite the mountain. You have to patiently build a new path around it.
So the healthy stance is the balance between those two. This is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener. It's saying, I have patterns and tendencies, my mountains and my flow, but I am fundamentally capable of learning, healing, and changing.
You have to respect the reality of your starting point, but you are not defined solely by your history. That's the only stance that allows for sustainable, realistic growth. It lets you take responsibility for your actions today while knowing that tomorrow's self is open for revision as long as you put in that heavy an effort for layer 2 change.
And understanding all this, it also drastically changes how we view ourselves and others when we fail or struggle. It's about compassion.
Yes, when you understand that the self is shaped by context, history, social mirroring, embodied trauma, that it's not some solitary, unchangeable essence, it fosters so much more compassion. You realize that negative behaviors or flaws are often rooted in a faulty narrative, facet 4, or environmental shaping, facet 3, not some immutable evil flaw in your core.
And the practical outcome of that is huge. We can be gentler with our own wounds and failures. We can see them not as these fixed final judgments on who we are, but as chapters that need compassionate rewriting and integration.
And that compassion extends to others. It allows for a more nuanced, understanding view. When someone changes drastically, for better or for worse, you can understand that their social context or their narrative or their physical health shifted, and that fundamentally changed the person without having to believe in some fixed good or bad essence.
Finally, these different views of the self, they inform the very nature of spiritual and psychological practices all over the world. And knowing the difference helps you choose the right tool for the right season of your life.
We see that different practices are targeting different facets of the self. Some practices aim to strengthen the self. These are focused on building strong boundaries, establishing self-respect, reinforcing a coherent, healthy identity and story. A lot of therapy is focused on this, helping a fragmented self build a workable, resilient narrative.
But then, conversely, you have other practices, a lot of them influenced by that no-self view, that aim to transcend the ego. This is meditation, contemplative prayer, things that try to soften the illusion of that solid, fixed I that feels separate and fragile and in control of everything.
And the value, as our sources confirm, is that both approaches can be crucial. just at different times. If you have a weak or fractured self-story, you have to strengthen it first. Only once you have a sturdy self can you safely begin the work of transcending it and experiencing yourself as flow.
So after going through fixed cores, fluid bundles, constructed stories, embodied realities, we can offer you, the learner, a really nuanced synthesis of what the self is. And the first thing to say is, it's not a single thing.
It is, in essence, a complex, layered paradox. The self is simultaneously the subject of your experience, a body-mind with habits and temperament, a story woven from memory and hope, a social being shaped by the world, and fundamentally a continuous causal process unfolding over time.
And can it change?
Yes, deep patterns and habits, even those mountains of temperament in layer 3, they can be shifted and channeled, sometimes dramatically, but only through consistent embodied effort at layer 2. And this change always happens within a framework of continuity, your body's structure, your overlapping memories, your relationships, that preserves a sense of you without needing a fixed substance.
So whether or not you believe in a permanent soul, the core conclusion here is that we're not totally trapped by our past and our nature, but we're not totally free of them either. We live in that tension, the tension between continuity, that feeling of I am still me, responsible for my past and possibility, that profound realization that I do not have to stay exactly this way.
And how you choose to navigate that inherent, defining tension with honesty about your limits, with patience for the slow process of biological rewiring, and with the courage to edit and rewrite your story truthfully, that is the central, ongoing project of the self. And that, we believe, is what you should continue to explore every day.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this knowledge serves you well. We'll see you next time.